Welcome to another episode of the Patio Pondering Podcast. Today is another solo episode based upon some work I'm doing on a side project I'm doing with a partner. You know, in swine nutrition and in a lot of life, we try to focus on the flashy, on the sexy. And I think that plays into our mental abilities to look at what's flashy and move to the next thing. And I think about on our crop production farm, we also sometimes think about sexy, whether it's a foliar application of a fungicide, fertilizer, something that has some really cool data. But in reality, sometimes we need to look back at the basics. And when you're talking about feeding pigs, and this has been true since I took Animal Science 102 with Merle Cunningham in 1990, that feed costs account for 70 to 75% of the cost of feeding a pig. And the funny part is, when I was looking at a closeout that a friend of mine shared for a project I'm working on talking about the economics of feeding pigs, guess what it is? It's 70% of the cost of feeding that group of pigs. Now, that closeout I was looking at had 800 and some pigs that were placed, ended up marketing like 760 or so pigs. But when you looked at it, feed costs for 70% of it. There are also some big categories. You had building costs, you had veterinary costs, but the biggest cost was feeding pigs. So as I'm partnering with a friend of mine to make this economics 101 for non-pig people and talking about how we look at the cost of feeding pigs and we look at the profitability of pigs, it's easy for us to think about, well, we got to keep vet costs under control and we got to keep medications under control. But the big one is feed. And the second one I would say would be mortality, because you divide all your costs by the number of pigs marketed. So every pig that dies had costs associated with it, but it doesn't give you any return on that pig. And if we think about what we're doing as we look at cost, we have to balance between the sexy and the mundane. And feed costs would fall into that mundane. You know, we make sure the feeders are full and we order feed. You know, the pigs need it. But what is the balance between the mundanity of feed with sexy, like automation? And do we have the best genetics? Do we upgrade the ventilation? Do we look at a Wi-Fi or Bluetooth-enabled controlling mechanism? Do we look at scales on the bins? Do we look at cameras in the barn? I mean, those are fun and sexy things. They're toys compared to feed costs. And then we balance the mundane of feed costs with emergencies. What happens if we have a PRRS outbreak? You know, we're going to look at interventions, like are we going to put something in the water? Are we going to do prophylactic antibiotics? Are we going to sorting? You know, the things that we have to do in an emergency. You know, what happens if we have a derecho come through and knocks out power and we lose a generator? We're going to have to do those emergency costs of upgrading a generator, bringing in emergency electricity. We're going to have somebody on site to drop those curtains. Or what happens if we have a well that dries up or our pump goes out? I mean, that's an emergency. We got to take care of that. Those are the emergency costs that balance out the mundane of feed. And as a swine nutritionist that's been post-grad for over 25 years and spent my entire graduate career looking at feed ain't sexy. It's corn, it's soybean meal. You throw some stuff in it, and you put it in a feeder. You weigh the feed, you weigh the pigs, and boom, here's what we had for feed conversion. There's typically nothing sexy about it, unless you're talking about some additives. Now, there's been some really sexy stuff about feed. I can think of a couple. Paling. That was really sexy when we added that to feed, getting a 7% improvement on carcass and feed efficiency with the inclusion of ractopamine the last 4 to 6 weeks of production. That was sexy. Phytase. When we added phytase to feed 25 years ago and reduced the amount of inorganic phosphate we had to add, that was sexy because we could go, hey, here's something that we can put in a feed that reduces your feed cost. That was sexy. Some could say that some of the direct fed microbials we have could be sexy. Some essential oils we could consider sexy, but they're just incremental changes to that 70% of the cost of production of feeding those pigs. So if feed costs are 70% of the cost of feeding a pig, where can we improve to make a bigger impact on that 70%? So if we reduced it from 70% to 69%, it doesn't take huge changes to affect that 70%. We can fine-tune formulations. And that was my job, making sure that we have the right lysine to calorie ratio, we have the right calcium to phosphorus ratio. Do we need to use higher levels of distillers grains? Those kinds of things. One thing that every producer can do on farm is manage their feed waste, getting this feeder set right. Kansas State has their pictures of appropriate coverage of feeder, and some people that question if that's right, but that's a tool that we can use to teach people to adjust their feeders. We can make sure that we don't run out of feed, because every time we have an out of feed event, we have pigs that go off feed, can have ulcers. We can have changes to their feed conversion because of fighting in the pen. So make sure that we never run out of feed. We can have our delivery schedule set up right so that we're getting the right feed and the right feeder at the right time. It sounds like 4 hours that we use with fertility on a crop ground. We need to make sure that we're following the budget. If we overfeed one of the more expensive feeds, say a grower 1 to a grower 2 pig or a grower 3 pig, that costs us money because we're giving too many nutrients to those pigs that don't need it. And it just goes out in manure, and the pig can't utilize that. We might get a boost in feed conversion, but it's typically not offset with the extra cost of those feeds. So following feed budgets. If you get to the end of your feeding program and you've got 1,200 pigs in your barn or in your room, and you don't feed close to what you need of that last diet because you've overfed the beginning of the budget, or the budget is wrong, you need to get that fixed. We can also look at smarter ingredient buying. Now, what are we doing with our corn and soybean meal price? Are we buying hand to mouth? Are we just saying what the market gives us, we take? Or are we contracting that? Now, soybean meal prices have finally dropped. We've been talking for the last 2 or 3 years that sustainable aviation fuel is going to be the savior of soybean meal prices for pig farmers and poultry farmers, because we're going to have a glut. Well, we got a glut. And we've got $250, $260 delivered bean meal. We can make some hay with that. And then the other thing that we can do, as I talked about some of the sexy things, we need to match the additives with a proven ROI. Unfortunately, we don't have Paline anymore. Not for want of the product, but international trade caused challenge with that. Utilizing phytase correctly. Do we superdose in a nursery and maybe the early grower feed to maximize the opportunity? Do we look at the calcium that we add to those diets so we're not inhibiting the phytase ability to reduce the amount of phosphorus we need? Are we using the appropriate amount of synthetic amino acids? Reduce the amount of total soybean meal we use there, increasing the energy of the diet, supposedly. Another one that we've forgotten about lately, because it's usually got too expensive, is how are we using fat? The easy way to improve feed conversion in a pig diet is to just add fat. Simple. And for years, we had lots and lots of rations that were corn, soy, distillers, and fat, because fat paid off. Do we look at using fat to improve those feed costs? And as we're looking at improving feed costs and how we try and find those little nuggets or in some cases the pebbles, let's look at the big things and not the small things. Let's not get distracted by the sexy. Let's do the fundamentals. No different than as we talked about with our crop producers. As we have these lower prices, you've got to get back to the fundamentals. Make sure you follow budget. Make sure the right feed is in the feeder at the time. Make sure your feed flow is appropriate. And make sure that the budget matches what we want it to be. Pretty simple. Those are some of those big rocks that we need to look at and not be distracted by those sexy nuggets. The innovation that we see at World Pork Expo or Iowa Pork Congress. Get the fundamentals right, and we'll be in a position where those sexy things might be able to work better because we have the fundamentals right. So as we end this short solo podcast talking about feed use in pigs, we're still at 70% of the cost of production is feed costs. When we had a higher corn price, higher soybean meal price, it was probably higher than that. We're working with $4 corn and $2.50, $2.75 bean meal. It's still 70% of the cost of raising those pigs. A majority of the cost. We need to concentrate on making sure we feed those pigs right. And as I mentioned, follow the budget, get the right feed and the right feeder, fine-tune your formulations. So bottom line, work with a nutrition professional. Work with me. I'll do consulting to help you. Get those budgets right. Because we need to extract every dollar we can from every pig that we can to recover from the equity we've lost the last few years. So, for those of you that aren't in the pig industry, and hung around for the last 11 minutes? What's your 70% in life or business? Where can you devote your time to get an incremental increase in what takes 75% of your expenses to improve your bottom line? And how can you look at working on the 70% instead of the 1%, 2% sexy that might be fun, but it distracts you from where the majority of your costs are? So think about that as you go about your day and work on your business. What is your 70%? Thanks for following along. We're going to dive into some people's ag roots later as we continue Patio Pondering, the podcast. And just we'll tease with a little announcement. We've launched our own website at www.patiopondering.com. A landing page for both our blog and our podcast. Check it out. And as always, I appreciate all the follows, the shares, and the comments. I'm looking for your suggestions on who you want to see as guests here on Patio Pondering.